Ethan Hale had learned how to disappear long before he ever set foot in a prison. He was the kind of man people looked through instead of at. Thin, soft-spoken, and always slightly hunched, Ethan moved through life like someone afraid of taking up space. In the small town of Ridgeway, where everyone knew everyone else's business, that alone made him unusual. Loud personalities thrived there. Ethan did not. Ridgeway was the kind of town that prided itself on safety. White fences, early bedtimes, and neighbors who waved every morning. Crime stories happened elsewhere, on the evening news, in cities with names people struggled to pronounce. That illusion shattered the night Laura Bennett was murdered. Laura was everything Ridgeway admired. She was a schoolteacher, patient and kind, known for staying late to help struggling students. Parents trusted her. Children adored her. When she was found dead in her living room, the town felt like it had been violated. Doors that had never been locked were bolted shut. Porch lights burned all night. Fear settled in quietly, like dust. The police arrived just after midnight. Rain had washed over the street, blurring footprints and soaking the grass. Inside the house, the scene was chaotic. A lamp lay shattered near the sofa. Blood stained the carpet. Laura's body showed signs of a struggle, but there were no obvious clues pointing to who had done it. No weapon. No forced entry. No clear motive. In the days that followed, pressure grew fast. Ridgeway wanted answers, and it wanted them immediately. The police questioned neighbors, co-workers, former students' parents, anyone who had ever crossed Laura's path. Tips poured in, many based on nothing more than suspicion and faith. That was when Ethan Hale's name surfaced. Ethan lived 3 streets away from Laura. He worked odd jobs, mostly repairs and small construction work. A few months earlier, he had fixed a broken section of Laura's fence. It was a simple job, paid in cash. Most people forgot about it. But now, nothing seemed small anymore. Someone told police they had seen Ethan walking near Laura's house the night she died. Another neighbor remembered a disagreement over payment for the fence repair. The stories were vague, uncertain, and inconsistent, but they all pointed in the same direction, toward the quiet man. When police brought Ethan in for questioning, he didn't resist. He never did. He answered the door politely and followed them without complaint. At the station, he sat in a hard chair under bright lights, hands folded tightly in his lap. He had never been interrogated before. He didn't know his rights. He didn't ask for a lawyer. The questions came fast. Where were you that night? Why were you near her house? Did you argue with her? Why did a witness say they saw you watching her home? Ethan tried to explain. He said he had been walking because he couldn't sleep. He said the argument wasn't serious. He said he didn't hurt Laura. But his voice shook. His words tangled. The detective saw weakness and pushed harder. Hours passed. Midnight turned into morning. Ethan grew exhausted, confused, and afraid. The room felt smaller with every question. At some point, one detective leaned forward and said something that would change everything. "We know you did it," he said. "We just need you to help yourself now." Ethan's world narrowed to that sentence. Help yourself. He thought that if he just said the right thing, this nightmare would end. He didn't understand that every word was being recorded, measured, and saved. When Ethan finally said, "Maybe I did something wrong," the detectives exchanged a glance. That single sentence became the foundation of the case. The arrest shocked some people in Ridgeway, but not many. Ethan was quiet. He kept to himself. People filled the gaps with their own fears. Silence, to them, felt suspicious. The trial began less than a year later. The courtroom was packed every day. Laura Bennett's family sat in the front row, eyes hollow with grief. Reporters filled the back benches, ready to tell the town that justice was coming. The prosecution told a simple story. Ethan Hale, a lonely man with hidden anger, had killed a beloved teacher after a disagreement. They spoke with confidence. They showed photos of the crime scene. They repeated Ethan's exhausted words again and again. The defense struggled. There was no physical evidence linking Ethan to the murder. No DNA. No murder weapon. No fingerprints that matched him. But doubt is harder to sell than certainty, and the jury was drowning in fear. Witnesses took the stand. One man claimed he saw Ethan near Laura's house. Another said Ethan seemed off in the weeks before the murder. Then Daniel Cross testified. Calm, clear, and convincing. He told the jury he saw Ethan outside Laura's home on the night she died. His words landed heavily in the room. Ethan watched from the defense table, barely recognizing the man being described. He wanted to speak, to shout, to explain, but his lawyer had told him to stay quiet. So he did what he had always done. He stayed silent. When the verdict came back guilty, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. Laura's family cried. Some people nodded, satisfied. Others stared at Ethan, waiting for him to react. He didn't. The judge sentenced Ethan Hale to death. As guards led him away, Ethan turned briefly toward the gallery. His eyes searched the room, as if hoping someone would see him, really see him, and understand. No one met his gaze. Death row was quieter than Ethan expected. The days blended together, marked only by meals and counts. In the solitude of his cell, Ethan finally began to understand what had happened to him. How fear had filled in the blanks. How his silence had been mistaken for guilt. He wrote letters every week, mostly to his sister, the only person who never doubted him. He wrote about the noise of the prison, the dreams that woke him at night, and the memory of Laura Bennett's face on the news. In every letter, he repeated the same truth. I didn't kill her. Years passed. Appeals failed. Evidence stayed locked away. Outside the prison walls, Ridgway moved on. New families moved in. Laura Bennett's name slowly faded from conversation, replaced by new worries, new stories. Inside his cell, Ethan counted the days. On the night he was told his final appeal had been denied, Ethan sat on his bunk for a long time, staring at the wall. He thought about the fence he had repaired, about how small choices could lead to impossible endings, about how quiet men were easy to overlook. He folded his hands and whispered to the empty cell, a promise he had made 1,000 times before. One day, he said, the truth will come out. At the time, no one believed it would. By the time the state scheduled Ethan Hale's execution, 10 long years had passed since the night Laura Bennett was murdered. A decade is enough time for anger to cool, for memories to blur, and for a case once shouted about on every street corner to fade into the background noise of life. In Ridgway, people rarely spoke Ethan's name anymore. To most of them, he was no longer a man. He was a decision that had already been made. On death row, time moved differently. Days stretched endlessly, yet years vanished without warning. Ethan marked the passing months by the small changes around him. New guards replaced old ones. Prison rules shifted. His hair turned gray at the temples. What never changed was the weight pressing on his chest every time he woke up, remembering where he was and why. Execution dates were strange things. They were announced calmly, almost politely, as if discussing a doctor's appointment. When the warden finally told Ethan that his date had been set, his voice carried no emotion. To him, it was routine. Ethan nodded. He had imagined this moment for years. Still, hearing it aloud felt unreal, like listening to someone else's fate being read out. News of the upcoming execution barely caused a ripple outside the prison. There were no protests, no late-night debates. The case had been settled long ago in the public mind. Laura Bennett's family released a short statement, saying they hoped the execution would bring peace. Many in Ridgway agreed. They wanted the final chapter closed. In the weeks leading up to the execution, Ethan met with a prison counselor, a chaplain, and his lawyer one last time. The lawyer looked tired and defeated. Every appeal had failed. Every door had closed. I'm sorry, the lawyer said quietly. We did everything we could. Ethan believed him. But belief didn't change the outcome. His sister visited 2 days before the execution. She sat on the other side of the glass, pressing her hand against it as if touch alone could keep him alive. Her eyes were red, her face thin from sleepless nights. I'm still fighting, she said, even after this. Ethan forced a smile. He didn't want her last memory of him to be pain. Live your life, he told her. That's how you help me. The night before the execution, Ethan was moved to a different cell, closer to the chamber. It was cleaner, quieter, and somehow more terrifying. Guards checked on him regularly. Every sound echoed. Sleep never came. He thought about his childhood, about summer evenings and long walks with nowhere to go. He thought about how a single sentence spoken under pressure had sealed his fate. Mostly, he thought about Laura Bennett. He wondered if she would believe him if she could hear him now. The execution was scheduled for just after midnight. Outside the prison, a small group of reporters waited in the cold. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, professional, almost clinical. Everything was planned to the minute. When guards came for Ethan, he stood without resistance. He had practiced this walk in his mind for years. Down the hallway, past the locked doors, toward the end. The execution chamber was smaller than he expected. Bright lights, a narrow bed, straps waiting patiently, a glass window where witnesses would watch. Ethan lay down as instructed. His wrists were secured, then his ankles, a final strap across his chest. Each movement felt distant, as if his body no longer belonged to him. The witnesses entered quietly. Laura Bennett's family sat together, holding hands. A few officials took their seats. A reporter scribbled notes. No one looked at Ethan for long. The warden asked if he had any final words. For a moment, Ethan considered saying nothing. Silence had defined his life, after all. But something inside him refused to let this be the end of his story. "You're killing the wrong man," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't do this. And whoever did, they're still out there." The room remained silent. No one responded. Final words were not arguments. They were formalities. The execution proceeded. As the drugs entered his body, Ethan felt a strange calm. His breathing slowed. His thoughts blurred. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat. At 12:04 a.m., Ethan Hale was pronounced dead. Just like that, the case was over. The official statement was released before sunrise. Another execution carried out. Another chapter of justice closed. By morning, news stations briefly mentioned it before moving on to fresher stories. In Ridgeway, life continued. Parents sent their children to school. Shops opened. The name Ethan Hale slipped further into the past. Laura Bennett's family visited her grave that week. They brought flowers and stood in silence, hoping the pain would finally lessen. For them, the execution was supposed to be the end of suffering. Instead, it left behind a strange emptiness. Justice, they had been told, would feel different. Inside the prison, Ethan's cell was cleared. His letters were boxed up. His few belongings were catalogued and stored. Another man would soon take his place. 3 days later, something happened that no one expected. Samuel Crowe was retired, living alone in a small apartment miles away from Ridgeway. He had spent 30 years as a detective before leaving the force, carrying more unsolved cases than solved ones in his memory. Laura Bennett's murder was one of them. Crowe had followed the execution on the news with a familiar knot in his stomach. He remembered the case too well. The lack of evidence, the speed of the trial, the feeling that something had been rushed. That night, Crowe sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop, unable to sleep. That was when the email arrived. There was no subject line, no name, just a short message and an attachment. Check the evidence locker. Case number 4471. You missed something. Crowe stayed at the screen for a long time. He had seen prank emails before, conspiracy messages. But this one felt different. Too specific. Too quiet. Case number 4471 was Laura Bennett's case. The attachment showed a photograph. Blurry, polylit, but clear enough to recognize. A dark jacket, stained heavily with dried blood. A small tag was visible near the collar, marked with an evidence number Crowe remembered well. His pulse quickened. That jacket had been found near the crime scene. It had been logged, photographed, and then dismissed. At the time, the lab was overwhelmed. Resources were limited. The jacket didn't seem important enough. Crowe had signed off on that decision. He closed the laptop and sat back, a cold realization settling over him. Ethan Hale had been executed. And now, someone was telling him the story wasn't over. The next morning, Crowe drove to the police station. He wasn't officially part of the department anymore, but some doors still opened for him. Old favors, old respect. When he reached the evidence locker, he requested access to case number 4471. The officer hesitated, reminding him the case was closed. Crowe didn't argue. He simply said, "Humor an old man." The locker door creaked open. There it was. The jacket. Crowe held it carefully, the weight of regret pressing down on him. If this jacket mattered, If it had always mattered, then something terrible had happened. Not just a mistake, but an irreversible one. As he stood there, holding a piece of evidence that had outlived the man blamed for the crime, Crow understood the truth. The execution had closed the case, but it hadn't closed the truth. And sometimes, the truth waits until there's nothing left to lose before it finally demands to be heard. Samuel Crow stood alone in the evidence room longer than he meant to. The jacket rested in his hands like something alive, heavy with years of neglect and quiet accusation. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, darkened by time, and carried a faint, sour smell that no amount of storage could erase. Crow remembered this jacket. He remembered the night it was found, half hidden behind a row of trash bins a short walk from Laura Bennett's house. At the time, it had seemed out of place, but not important enough. The case had already begun to point in a different direction. Now, holding it again, Crow felt a deep, sinking shame. Ethan Hale was dead. The system had spoken its final word. And yet here was this jacket, untouched by science, untouched by truth, quietly waiting. Crow requested DNA testing that same day. The paperwork took hours. There were questions, resistance, reminders that the case was closed and the man convicted was already executed. Crow ignored the tone and the warnings. He had lived long enough to know when procedure mattered less than conscience. When the jacket was finally sent to the lab, Crow drove home with a restless mind. He replayed the trial in his head, every witness, every assumption, every shortcut taken in the name of speed and certainty. He remembered Ethan's face in the interrogation room, pale and lost, nodding along as if agreement might save him. Crow barely slept. The results came back 2 weeks later. The blood on the jacket did not belong to Laura Bennett. That alone was enough to shake the foundation of the entire case. But the report didn't stop there. The DNA belonged to a woman whose profile already existed in the system. A woman reported missing 2 years after Laura's murder. Her name was Natalie Rowe. Crow read the report twice, then a third time, his hands trembling slightly. If Natalie Rowe's blood was on that jacket, then whoever owned it had attacked more than once. And if that jacket was connected to Laura Bennett's murder, then the killer had never been caught at all. The implications were devastating. Crow contacted the department immediately, insisting on a review. This time, he wasn't asking. The state had executed a man. Now there was evidence suggesting the real killer had continued hurting people afterward. That revelation moved fast. Detectives reopened files long sealed and yellowed with age. Unsolved assaults, attempted abductions, missing persons cases within a 50-mile radius of Ridgeway were pulled from storage. Patterns began to emerge almost immediately. Late-night attacks, single female victims, quiet neighborhoods, no forced entry. Each case alone had seemed small, unfortunate, easy to dismiss. Together, they told a different story. The jacket became the center of everything. Fibers were analyzed. Soil samples compared. A faint scent of industrial cleaner on the fabric matched a brand sold only at a local hardware store during a short period years earlier. The pictures sharpened slowly, piece by piece. Then came the fingerprint. Back during the original investigation, a partial fingerprint had been recovered from the broken lamp near Laura Bennett's body. It was smudged, incomplete, and impossible to match with the technology available at the time. It had been logged, labeled, and forgotten. The assumption had been simple. The killer wore gloves or wiped the scene clean. Now, with updated software and broader databases, the fingerprint was run again. The match came back within hours. Daniel Cross. Crow felt the air leave his lungs. Daniel Cross had not only been known to the case, he had been a key witness. Calm, confident, and articulate, Daniel had testified that he saw Ethan Hale near Laura's house on the night of the murder. His statement had helped erase doubt in the jury's mind. He had seemed helpful, reliable, and cooperative. Too cooperative. Crow pulled Daniel's file from storage. As he read through it, more red flags appeared. Minor assault charges that had been dismissed. Stalking complaints that never reached court. Job changes every few months. Residences that rarely lasted a year. None of it had been shared during Ethan's trial. Why? The answer was uncomfortable. Daniel Cross fit the image of a good witness. He spoke clearly. He made eye contact. He showed emotion in the right places. Ethan Hale, by contrast, was awkward, quiet, and unsure. The system had trusted the man who looked confident. The deeper Crow looked, the clearer the picture became. Daniel Cross had lived within walking distance of Laura Bennett at the time of her murder. He knew her routine. He had even attended a community meeting she organized months earlier. His name appeared in Laura's phone records, listed under a short call made the week she died. That call had never been explained. Crow shared the findings with the district attorney's office. The reaction was explosive. Panic mixed with disbelief. An execution could not be undone. But the truth demanded a response. Daniel Cross was located living under a slightly altered name in another state. When officers arrived at his apartment, they found several items that chilled them instantly. A box of women's jewelry, newspaper clippings about Laura Bennett's murder, and a jacket matching the one found years earlier, missing only one sleeve. Daniel was arrested without incident. During the first interrogation, he denied everything. He smiled calmly, asked for water, and insisted he had helped police years ago out of concern. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, the fingerprint match, and the pattern of similar crimes, his confidence cracked. The room grew quiet. After hours of silence, Daniel finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd ever look again," he said. The confession came slowly, then all at once. Daniel admitted to killing Laura Bennett after she rejected his advances. He described how he panicked, how he left the jacket behind without realizing it would survive. He admitted to testifying against Ethan because Ethan was convenient, quiet, alone, easy to point at. Then he said something that turned the room cold. "When you executed him," Daniel said, "I knew I was safe." Daniel confessed to attacking Natalie Rowe and 2 other women. One survived. One did not. All of it happened after Ethan Hale had been convicted. The room fell silent. News of the confession spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed the unthinkable. An innocent man had been executed. A serial offender had walked free for years because the system had stopped looking. Ethan Hale's name returned to the public eye, no longer as a murderer, but as a symbol of failure. Crow attended the press conference where the district attorney confirmed the truth. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. None of it felt real. Later that night, Crow visited Ethan's sister. He didn't know what to say. There were no words large enough. She listened quietly as Crow explained everything. The jacket, the DNA, Daniel Cross. When he finished, she closed her eyes and nodded slowly. "I knew," she said. "I always knew." She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply sat there, holding a photograph of Ethan, as if memoizing his face all over again. For Crow, the guilt was unbearable. He had missed the evidence. He had trusted the wrong certainty. He had helped build a case that led to an execution. The evidence had always been there. It had waited patiently, silently, for someone to care enough to listen. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't bring relief. It brought horror. Because proving Ethan Hale's innocence did not save him. It only proved that the system designed to protect the innocent had taken his life instead. And there was nothing anyone could do to undo it. Daniel Cross had always known how to present himself. Even in handcuffs, even seated in a stark interrogation room under harsh fluorescent lights, he appeared calm, almost relaxed. His posture was straight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. If someone didn't know what he had done, they might mistake him for a man unfairly accused. That had always been his greatest strength. The investigators watching him through the one-way glass felt a growing sense of dread. They weren't just dealing with a killer. They were dealing with someone who understood people, someone who knew how to become whatever the moment required. When the questioning began, Daniel denied everything. He spoke politely, correcting small details, asking for clarification. He said he had helped police years ago because Ridgeway was his home and Laura Bennett had been a good person. He said he had no idea why his name was being dragged into the past. Then the evidence was placed in front of him. The fingerprint match, the DNA from the jacket, the connection to Natalie Rowe. One by one, the walls closed in. Daniel's calm expression faltered. Just for a second. His eyes shifted. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. Silence filled the room. For nearly an hour, Daniel said nothing. He stared at the surface of the table as if searching for answers written into the wood. The investigators waited. They had learned patience the hard way. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You really went back?" he said softly. That was the moment they knew. Daniel's confession did not come with tears or rage. It came with a strange honesty, as if he were relieved to stop pretending. He spoke about Laura Bennett first. He said he admired her, that he watched her from a distance, that he imagined she would see something special in him. When she didn't, something inside him broke. He described the night of the murder in chilling detail. How he knocked on her door, pretending to need help. How the argument escalated. How fear turned into violence. He admitted leaving the jacket behind, too focused on escaping to notice. When asked about Ethan Hale, Daniel's mouth twisted into something close to a smile. I needed someone else to stand there, he said. And he was perfect. Daniel explained how he had noticed Ethan long before the arrest. A quiet man, no close family nearby, no one to defend him loudly. Daniel admitted to spreading small rumors in the neighborhood, planting the idea that Ethan was strange, that he had a temper. By the time police started asking questions, the image was already formed. Testifying against Ethan had been easy. Daniel had rehearsed his story carefully. He knew what details would sound convincing. He knew how to speak with certainty without saying too much. The jury believed him because they wanted to believe him. The most disturbing part of the confession came next. After Ethan was sentenced, Daniel felt untouchable. The fear that had once driven him faded, replaced by confidence. He said he watched the news coverage of the trial with fascination, listening as experts discussed motives and psychology that had nothing to do with him. I thought I'd gotten away with it, he said. And then you killed him. Daniel described watching Ethan's execution on television. He said it felt final, like a door closing behind him. Whatever risk had existed was gone. The system had made its choice. That was when he started again. Daniel confessed to attacking Natalie Rowe 2 years later. He said he didn't plan it at first, but the urge returned stronger than before. He believed the police would never connect new crimes to a case already closed. He was right. As the confession ended, the room felt heavy. Investigators sat in silence, realizing the full cost of their mistake. An innocent man had died, and others had suffered because the truth had been ignored. The arrest of Daniel Cross made national headlines within hours. News channels replayed footage of his original trial testimony alongside clips of his confession. The contrast was horrifying. The same man, the same voice, telling two completely different stories. Public reaction was immediate and furious. Protests erupted outside courthouses. Activists demanded answers. How could a system built on evidence and justice allow this to happen? How could a witness with a hidden history of violence be trusted without question? The district attorney held a press conference, his face pale and strained. He admitted that mistakes had been made. Evidence had not been fully tested. Background checks had been incomplete. The words sounded weak compared to the reality. Ethan Hale's case was reopened officially, though everyone knew what the outcome would be. A man who had been executed could not stand trial again. The process was symbolic, a legal acknowledgement of truth rather than a path to justice. Inside the courtroom, Ethan's sister sat alone as the judge reviewed the new evidence. The DNA results, the confession, the fingerprint match. Each piece erased the conviction that had destroyed her brother's life. The judge spoke slowly, carefully. Ethan Hale is hereby exonerated of all charges related to the murder of Laura Bennett. The words echoed through the room. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters rushed forward. But inside the courtroom, there was only silence. No celebration. No relief. Only the heavy understanding that innocence recognized after death changes nothing. Laura Bennett's family released a statement soon after. They expressed shock, grief, and anger. They said they had trusted the system and were devastated to learn the truth. Their pain had been used to justify the wrong ending. Daniel Cross was formally charged with multiple murders and assaults. This time, there was no doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. He showed no emotion as he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the families of his later victims, the conviction came too late. Like Ethan's family, they were left with questions that had no answers. How many lives could have been saved if the truth had been found sooner? In Ridgeway, the story changed the town forever. People spoke in hushed tones about Ethan Hale, about how easily fear had replaced fairness. A memorial appeared near the courthouse steps, simple and unassuming, bearing Ethan's name and a single sentence. Innocent. Samuel Crowe visited the memorial often. Each time, he stood in silence, remembering the jacket, the fingerprint, the moments when he could have looked closer. He knew apologies were meaningless now. Daniel Cross had lied, and the world had believed him. But the deeper truth was harder to accept. The lie only worked because so many people were ready to stop asking questions. And that, more than any single confession, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The official declaration of Ethan Hale's innocence came on a quiet morning, 6 months after the world learned the truth. There was no crowd outside the courthouse. No applause. Just a handful of reporters and a legal clerk reading words that should have been spoken more than a decade earlier. The document stated clearly that Ethan Hale had not murdered Laura Bennett, and that his conviction was a grave error. For the justice system, it was a correction. For Ethan's family, it was a wound reopened. Ethan's sister, Claire, stood in her kitchen listening to the news on a small radio. She had imagined this moment for years, but not like this. In her mind, Ethan was alive when the truth came out. He walked free. He stood in sunlight. That was how the story was supposed to end. Instead, she sat alone, holding a piece of paper that confirmed what she had always known, while her brother lay in a grave marked with a number instead of a name. The state issued a formal apology within days. The governor called the case a tragic failure. Officials spoke about lessons learned, about reform, about moving forward. Their words were careful and polished, designed to sound meaningful without admitting too much. Claire watched the press conference on television and turned it off halfway through. An apology could not undo an execution. Ethan's remains were exhumed and returned to his family. For the first time, Claire was able to bury her brother properly. The funeral was small. A few friends from childhood attended. Some people from Ridgeway came quietly, standing at a distance, unsure if they were welcome. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Claire thought about the last letter Ethan had written to her before his execution. In it, he had apologized for being a burden, for causing her pain, for not being strong enough to survive the system that crushed him. He had ended the letter the same way he always did. Don't stop believing in the truth. She whispered those words again as the earth covered his grave. The case changed the country in ways few stories ever do. Laws were re-examined. Evidence storage rules were tightened. DNA testing became mandatory in capital cases. Interrogation practices were reviewed, especially those involving vulnerable suspects. On paper, the system improved. But for many people, especially those who followed Ethan's story closely, the reforms felt hollow. Because reform meant admitting the mistake only after it had already destroyed a life. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail of the case. Ethan Hale became a symbol, his face appearing on screens across the world. People debated his silence, his confession, his execution. Some asked how such a thing could happen. Others asked how often it already had. Samuel Crowe refused interview requests. He retired fully, cutting off contact with the media. The guilt followed him everywhere. He replayed moments from the investigation endlessly, wondering what would have happened if he had insisted on testing the jacket sooner, if he had questioned Daniel Cross more deeply, if he had trusted his instincts instead of procedure. Crowe visited Ethan's grave once, standing quietly with his hat in his hands. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Daniel Cross disappeared from public conversation quickly after his sentencing. Life in prison erased his voice, his lies, his influence. But his shadow remained. Every mention of Ethan Hale carried Daniel's name behind it, like a reminder that evil doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks helpful. Laura Bennett's family struggled with a different kind of pain. For years, they believed justice had been done. They had grieved, healed, and tried to move forward. Now they were forced to confront the truth that the man executed for Laura's murder had been innocent, and the real killer had lived freely for years. They released a statement asking for privacy and expressing sorrow for Ethan's family. It was not an easy statement to write. Grief, once settled, had been violently disturbed. In Ridgeway, the town that once wanted quick answers learned what happens when fear leads the way. People spoke openly now about their doubts, their silence, their regrets. Some admitted they had never truly believed Ethan was guilty, but had been afraid to say so. Others confessed they had judged him simply because he was different. A memorial was built near the courthouse, simple and unadorned. It bore Ethan Hale's name and the dates of his life. Beneath it, a single sentence was engraved: executed by mistake. Visitors left flowers. Some left letters. Others stood quietly, reading the words again and again, as if hoping they might change. Claire visited the memorial often. She watched strangers mourn her brother, a man they had never met. It brought her comfort and pain in equal measure. Ethan was no longer invisible, but it had taken his death to make him seen. Years passed. Ethan Hale's case became a reference point in law schools, a warning in ethics classes, a name spoken with caution in courtrooms. Judges cited it when urging juries to weigh evidence carefully. Defense attorneys used it to argue for doubt. Activists used it to question the death penalty itself. And slowly, quietly, the conversation changed. People began to ask whether any system run by humans could be trusted with irreversible punishment, whether certainty was ever truly certain, whether silence should ever be mistaken for guilt. Ethan Hale did not live to see that change. But his story lived on. On the anniversary of his execution, Claire stood at his grave once more. She placed a small wooden marker beside the stone, something she had carved herself. It read simply, "Believed." Because that was what Ethan had wanted most, to be believed. In the end, justice came, but it came too late. It arrived after the doors had closed, after the final breath had been taken, after the truth no longer had the power to save a life. Ethan Hale was innocent. Those words echoed through history, heavy and unchangeable. They served as a reminder that the cost of getting justice wrong is not measured in paperwork or apologies, but in human lives that cannot be returned, and that once a man is executed, even the truth cannot bring him back.